Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American Republic?
Hello, everyone. More than 4 years ago, we did a show on tyranny, the problem of using absurdity to depict tyrants, particularly the two leading tyrants of the 20th century, Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler, with a writer who has studied in his whole life tyranny, Stalin and Hitler, both as a writer and as a movie maker, Laurence Rees. He has a new book out. It's called The Nazi Mind, 12 Warnings from History. And Laurence, who, as I said, has written on Auschwitz, on the Nazis, and of course on Hitler and Stalin, is joining us from Chiswick in West London. Now, Laurence, it seems a little incongruous to be writing about Stalin and particularly Hitler from Chiswick, of all places.
Why is that? Where should I be?
Berlin, perhaps.
Well, oddly enough,
Chiswick. I mean, Chiswick has always been a somewhat comic place, isn't it?
Really? Well, how about the world expert in Adolf Hitler and one of the 2 or 3 greatest historians of the last 100 years, Professor Sir Ian at Kershaw, my great guru, lives in Didsbury, Manchester. Is that as bad for him, the world expert in Hitler, to live in Didsbury? Or alternatively, probably, in my view, one of the greatest Holocaust historians, Professor Chris Browning, who I think is one of the greatest intellects ever. He's professor at Duke University. What on earth being a world expert in the Holocaust at Duke University? I mean, it's kind of, you could...
Well, actually, the Duke, we did a show on Charlottesville a couple of weeks ago, and of course Duke is in the American South, so perhaps it's more relevant. But in all seriousness, Laurence, how does one become an expert on what you call the Nazi mind? It must be rather disturbing. As I said, you've spent your life either writing about the Nazis and the Stalinists, or making a series of movies. You've won all sorts of awards. One of your movies, you were telling me before we went live, won a Peabody in the United States. How have you done it? Why have you done it?
Well, the serious answer is I never imagined this would be my career. I went to university, and I really, my great dream was to make documentaries, to be a documentary filmmaker, specifically to be a documentary filmmaker making historical documentaries. That's something that I think, going right back to when I watched World at War as a young teenager, it's what I wanted to do. And I was phenomenally fortunate because I got on straight after I graduated Oxford. I got on BBC researcher training course, which is a graduate course, and was phenomenally lucky because there's, imagine the number of people that age want to go and work in TV. So that was the greatest break of my life in terms of setting me up. Mark Thompson, who I think now is president of CNN.
And Mark Thompson, who
he's a colleague of mine. You can tell, whose career's flourished there, right? I mean, he was the year after me intake, and I remember.
Well, you should have probably focused on management rather than studying the Nazis, and then you'd run CNN.
If you knew anything about me, you wouldn't say I should have focused on management. But but I remember when he got when he was appointed Director General of the BBC, in his opening speech, he took out the letter that he got from the BBC Appointments Board in 1979, whenever it was, and said, you know, you've now got a place on the researcher training scheme. And he said, this is it. This is what's, you know, it's a big, so that was the biggest, most wonderful thing that could happen to me career-wise. You were still on contract. You still had to get a job, you know, lots of obstacles ahead. But that was to me, that's the big thing. So I got into television, which was my dream. And then I managed to maneuver a way around that. I was able to start working on historical documentaries, which is what I'd always wanted to do. And then by the time I was 25, amazingly, I was making them. And what I loved about making them was the journalism involved in talking to people. And I started making films about the period that's always most interested me, which is the Nazi Second World War. And I had immense lucky breaks. One was that we were interviewing former Nazis at a time in their lives when they'd just retired, but before they were still compos mentis, but they just retired and they were open to talking.
Well, they hadn't retired as Nazis. You mean they'd retired from the workforce? They
retired from their jobs. Yeah. They were former Nazis. Most of them went on to big jobs. I mean, one of the most, the kind of most still outspoken former member of the SS I met, he was after the war, and he was in a gulag with Stalin. After the war, he became a senior executive with the German car company. Well, he wasn't going to talk about his time in the SS when he was still selling, you know, trying to sell high-end motor cars.
What year, Laurence, did you, I'm not being nosy here in terms of your age, but what year did you get into it?
Well, I joined the BBC in 1978 at the age of 4. Actually, I wasn't 4, I was 21.
Right. So I'm just trying to historicize this in terms of Nazi studies. Hannah Arendt's book, Eichmann.
Yeah, way before me. Yeah, give me a break. That's way before me.
Right, but I'm contextualizing it, Laurence. Yeah. Eichmann in Jerusalem, where Arendt famously, very controversially wrote about the banality of evil, came out in the early 60s. It was enormously controversial. It was the first book that really tried to get into the mind, or one of the first books, certainly one of the more influential books that tried to get into the mind of the Nazis. When you got into the field, what was it like? I mean, were people still arguing about Eichmann in Jerusalem and Arendt's notion of the banality of evil?
The big debate. I mean, I got into it through journalism. I got into it through making films with these people, and so this was around late 80s, very early 90s. And then for the first big series I did on the Nazis, Warning from History, I was by then very close to, as I say, I think one of the great intellectuals of all time, certainly a huge influence on my life, Professor Syrian Kershaw. And he was the consultant on the Nazi series. And bear in mind also at that point, we had another great lucky break, which was the fall of the Berlin Wall opened up for us. Archives, interviewees, all of this stuff, people had never before been able to talk freely about this history. And we thought, again, wrong prediction, we thought this is going to be a fantastic period for learning because Russia's going to be this great new democracy, given what happened. But the kind of debate, historicized debate or historiographical debate around this area was still kind of focused on functionalism or intentionalism around the regime, crudely put as, is it all down to Hitler or was it all the structures around him and the culture and so on? And of course, like all of these big history dilemmas, the answer is it's a bit of both.
Has anything really, though? I mean, Arendt's book, as I said, was enormously influential. She actually attended the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. I think she was covering it for the New Yorker. And the book was loathed by many Jews, but I think it's aged, actually, in my view, rather well, but that's another issue. Has anything really changed since the debate about the Arendt began about what you call in your new book, the Nazi mind? Has anything been learned or unlearned? Has anything been resolved?
Well, yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, it certainly changed for me because I never agreed with that book in the first place. So
what, the Arendt book?
No, because so it's changed for me. And it's changed for me through meeting these people. And also, if you read Chris Browning's Ordinary Man, I mean, that's a radically different interpretation, which was a groundbreaking book. So yeah, of course, lots has changed since then. Absolutely. And I think, Chris, I think at Chapel Hill, not Duke. Yeah, I think it's at Chapel Hill. Anyway, same kind of bailiwick. But his book was an extraordinary piece of work. And that's going back, 25, 30 years. But yeah, I mean, the whole point of history is it always moves forward and changes, because very often what history is about is as much the time of the historians writing it as the history. If you go back and read Fest, I love Fest's biography.
Joachim Fest, the German historian.
But it's nothing compared to Ian's.
Yeah, Ian Kershaw. So let's get to your book, this new book, The Nazi Mind, 12 Warnings from History, hugely successful already, both in book form and as an audio book. Is there such a thing, Laurence, as the title of the book, The Nazi Mind? What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, I had to say in the introduction, I mean, I thought it was self-evident, to be honest. But someone said to me, so you're saying there's one big Nazi mind? I go, no. I'm saying that each Nazi or Nazi supporter had a mind, and I'm talking about how those mentalities developed. And of course, they develop differently in different people. But sooner than call it a variety of different Nazi minds, I think me and the publisher thought it was an obvious shorthand to call it the Nazi mind, rather than implying there's one gigantic.
No, I understand that, but can we make then some generalizations from your point of view about what exactly the Nazi mind includes?
Well, I think it's you can certainly say that it involves subscribing to Nazi ideology. And what you can say about the Nazis' ideology is that it's profoundly anti-democratic, that it's revolutionary, that it's profoundly, violently nationalistic, and that it's almost certainly, in the whole of history, the most single racist ideology the world's ever seen.
What about the Jewish question, of course, which is so central to what many people believe is so central to the Nazi mind? When you talk about the racism, I mean, obviously the Nazis were against gypsies who were mass murdered, homosexuals, black people. They didn't always get their hands on many black people in Europe. But were the Jews special within the Nazi mind, or were they somehow symbolic of everything that was wrong with the world?
Yeah. By talking about Nazi racism, I'm including that, although racism is a very difficult word to use now, because it was bandied around at the time, left, right, and center. But now people say, well, no, you can't talk about, even though there's still a crime of race hatred in our country, and people do still use the word, actually, if you're being completely politically correct, you talk about ethnic minorities and ethnic differences and so on. So the whole nomenclature around this is an absolute minefield. But yes, as you say, of course, the core belief, absolutely, of all of this is a deep, profound, virulent hatred of Jews. And that's bound up in this sense that Hitler had, what he wanted was purity of race, as he, in his words, that's what he wanted. And the single core, always, he's got all these different hate groups, but the penumbra, the absolute core of that hate group was always, and throughout his political career. I mean, he wrote, from when he wrote the letter in September 1919 outlining this, his absolute profound core hatred was the Jews. But he had a different, he phrased it and had a different attitude with hatred towards the Jews than the previous generations of what you might call traditional Christian-based anti-Semitism. You've got the one crucial thing to understand is his was very different. It had nothing to do, as he saw it, with the Jewish religion. It went back to blood. It went back to this kind of zany idea he had that related to different races. This zany idea he had that it didn't matter whether you were a practicing Jew religious-wise or not. If we could trace Jewish heritage, you were dangerous, which is one of the reasons that the Holocaust was so all-encompassing. Unlike in previous anti-Semitic attacks going back hundreds and hundreds of years, there wasn't a possibility of a Jew saving themselves by saying, no, I'm baptized Christian. No. The Nazis saw you as a Jew based on your Jewish heritage. And so you found that there was no escape. There was absolutely
we've done a number of shows, Laurence, on eugenics and on the popularity of eugenic theory, particularly the idea that whites are superior to blacks in the United States, although in Europe it took on a different form. Obviously, the close association of the eugenics movement and the Nazis didn't do that theory or quote unquote science much good. How mainstream do you think the Nazi mind was? How much of a consequence of scientific or quasi-scientific progress, reaction against modernity, against capitalism, against globalization? How can you fit it into the narrative of reaction against what was happening in the early part of the 20th century?
Yeah, it was certainly all of those. It was certainly all of those things. The Nazi movement came in many respects out of, in German, what was called the Völkisch movement. Not exactly, but it's as a rough guide, and that was in some respects a revolt against the incredible pace of modernity. In Germany, no nation changed as much as Germany in Europe, as much as Germany did in the 19th century. Extraordinary period of unification, of modernization, and a number of people, not the majority, but a number of people began to be extremely concerned about that, and they saw it, hence the Nazi obsession with forests as opposed to cities, the Nazi hatred of department stores, which they saw as run by Jews, and they hated department stores because they thought they were putting little artisans in villages making kind of cuckoo clocks out of business. So there was all of that, although of course a lot of it was just in the shop window, because they were running gigantic armaments factories, which weren't, with a lot of trees around. But the substantive point is quite important that you make, which is that you mustn't run away with the idea that this is a profound, all-encompassing German thing, in the sense that it wasn't. I mean, the crucial statistic people should hold on to is that in 1928, the Nazis only got 2.6% of the vote. The vast majority of Germans rejected them, and they've been around for years. And they rejected them because of all the obvious reasons you can think of to reject them. And then 5 years later, Hitler's chancellor. What changes is economic depression, although not just that, because Britain and America suffered economic depression too. Economic depression coupled with a failure of democracy to deal with the problems that were happening. And that led to the second thing that people should take away as a warning from that period, which is in 1932, a majority of Germans in voting for either the communists or the Nazis were knowingly voting for parties openly saying, we're going to destroy democracy. And so imagine it, a cultured nation at the heart of Europe, a majority of people vote to have this the last chance they can vote. That's how bad they thought democracy had failed them. So yes, it's a mix of all these preconditions, but you're getting nowhere if you're a Nazi in 1928 versus a load of external conditions are coming in that's going to allow Hitler to become chancellor in 1933. And even then, the Nazis don't get a majority of the vote.
We did a show a couple of years ago with Peter Ross Range. I'm sure you're familiar with his work, another best-selling book, 1924, the year that made Hitler. He argued that Hitler only became quote-unquote Hitler in 1924.
Yeah, very good.
He began to sort of understand the potential of Nazism, the populist potential. How central was image and marketing in your view? And is that something that we need to beware when we talk about the Nazi mind, the the dangers of marketing and of imagery?
Yeah, it was huge. It was absolutely huge. One of the very first films I made about this and wrote a book, long forgotten, in 1992. I did a history of propaganda, and the central feature of this TV series, The History of Propaganda, was the work of Joseph Goebbels. And I wrote a book analyzing Goebbels' techniques and actually showing how many of them are still alive today, unconsciously, albeit, used by political consultants, because he was a pioneer and a horribly evil, unspeakable guy. But he had a level of understanding about modern media that was revolutionary for the time. And one of the things he understood was that, and this is one of the warnings I talk about in the book, is how vital it was for the particular type of leader that Hitler was, who was a charismatic leader. Not to say he's a great guy. That's a definition that the sociologist Max Weber used to describe different types of leadership, and Hitler certainly falls within charismatic leadership. That it was vital for a charismatic leader that the population see him as a hero. And of course, Hitler was fortunate in that he won the Iron Cross during the First World War, and he was able to trumpet the fact that he was an ordinary soldier who dodged the bullets, all of this. But where 1924 is vital, and I agree, it's a crucial turning point year, is that he's able to stand up at his trial and say, hey, I'm tried for high treason, but I defy you all. And he makes these extraordinarily, apparently brave speeches from the dock, which get publicity across Germany, if not the rest of the world. And he's suddenly known. But it's a fake, because he knew that the judges were going to be sympathetic to him, particularly one of the judges who had already been sympathetic to him in a previous trial. So he knew he could spout all this stuff at little risk. But the notion of a charismatic leader being a hero figure is incredibly useful and important. And that was something that I think Goebbels was incredibly well aware of.
And ironically, of course, it was Edward Bernays, the nephew of Freud, who popularized this, not Nazi propaganda, but the idea, I guess, of propaganda. Your BBC colleague has made a series of films about Bernays. I was at the Nazi museum in Munich last year. I'm sure you've been there many times. And I saw an early photo of Hitler without his mustache. And he didn't seem to be Hitler. Well, he obviously wasn't without the mustache. Do you think the mustache was important? Could we imagine a Nazi mind without a mustache?
No, I don't see that as playing.
So he could have done it.
He had a very droopy one and a short one. I don't know. I read somewhere, or someone said he was worried about the size of his nose, and but no. To be honest, I think that's trivial. I don't see the mustache as playing.
There is something, and I've always thought this, which is why I like some of the more satirical stuff on the Nazis and on Hitler. There is something incredibly absurd about Hitler when you see photos of him without his mustache, when you see him in his tight little shorts. Now
this is the problem, that it would be. I was in the National Gallery the other day and saw a fantastic portrait of Sir Francis Drake, who is, in history, is one of the most epic, extraordinary figures that's ever lived. One of the bravest men in the history of the world for his voyage around the world. And a truly incredible figure with lots of flaws. But anyway, Francis Drake, there's this giant portrait of him. He's dressed almost entirely in pink. There he is, this great warrior, and he's got these sort of pink, he's pink. And you're going, what on earth? What, Francis, pink, come on. And of course, it's because we're bringing the values of our time to history. And I think that in terms of what Hitler's looking like when he's in the lederhosen and everything, you go down to Berchtesgaden in southern Germany, and you'll see any number of kind of overweight middle-aged people wearing lederhosen, and you go, good God. But
you're allowed to call them fat, Laurence, on this show. They're not just overweight, they're fat. I wonder whether we can also get something from your book. You talked about historicizing the Nazis, and everything's changed since Arendt triggered this huge debate in the early 60s. The subtitle of your book, The Nazi Mind, is 12 Warnings from History. I wonder if we collectively now, in the mid-2020s, we seem to be almost terrified by history. Obviously, the Nazis offer a particular warning about history, but there are lots of books like this. We get them on the show all the time. Warnings from history. Why are we so scared these days from history?
Well, because we should be terrified about what's happening now, shouldn't we?
I'm no more terrified now than, I don't know, any other time in history. Why
Really?
now, particularly?
Really? With democracy, have you seen the figures about the shrinking number of democracies in the world?
Tell me, I haven't.
I understand it. You don't see a whole load of countries suddenly becoming democratic. On the contrary, what you see is democracies under tremendous threat. You see countries where you look just in Europe. You see countries where judges are being replaced, where free press is under threat.
Well, perhaps Hungary.
Look what happened in Russia. When as I say, in the early 1990s, that there was a sense of this incredible opening up with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and yet, and we got all sorts of material out of Russia, including interviewees, but also archival material. And then when I carried on making films there, and the last one I think was up to about 2008. And by the time I ended, we were being followed around by the FSB, the secret police. That's how difficult it was. So you could see that things were collapsing there. You could see that. Look at the issue of Iran and the nuclear weapons. Look at what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, my perception is absolutely, compared to going right back through my lifetime, it's the most dangerous time of my lifetime. That's what I think.
More dangerous. I mean, you were young in the early 60s, Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Well, I wasn't alive. I was alive then, but
more dangerous than the Russians, the Soviet American standoff over Israel, and potentially.
There's never any. I never felt. Certainly, because of mutual assured destruction and the sense that the Soviet Union was this kind of behemoth, just dying, just regime, but not a kind of passivity to it, and not particularly threatening. So no, I never didn't feel this level of change. Look at you've only got to open a newspaper to see how people keep saying how American democracy is under threat.
I take your point, and as I said,
it's not be worse now.
Well, as I said, we did the book on Charlottesville with Deborah Baker, who warns about the reappearance of fascism. The Unite the Right rally in 2017 was shocking because of the clear manifestation of Nazi flags. And I take your point, but in all seriousness, when I was growing up, Khmer Rouge in Cambodia were murdering millions of people. Huge percentage of Cambodian people were mass murdered by the Khmer Rouge. We don't see any books about the Pol Pot mind or the Khmer Rouge mind. I wonder whether we are particularly living in a period of sort of weird pessimism. Maybe not so much weird. Maybe, as you say, it's logical.
I mean, well, certainly I've seen lots of books about Pol Pot. There was a brilliant one that James Fenton was involved with, that Faber Pub. So
that was many years ago. The Fenton book.
But in terms of effects on world history, tragic as those events were, it's not comparable with the gigantic events of the Second World War and the Nazis. The Second World War was by far the biggest, bloodiest war in the history of the world. The Holocaust, in my view, is beyond imagination the worst crime in the history of the world. So no, I don't see it as some kind of weird, inexplicable.
But let me rephrase the question then. We seem to be particularly sensitive, and you're on the front lines of this, to the reappearance of Nazism as we speak. Kanye West has been blocked from entering Australia over what's called his Hitler song. Elon Musk got into trouble a few months ago for supposedly doing a Nazi salute, even though he was probably drugged out at the time. Do you think that we're perhaps a little oversensitive to some of this stuff, or is it all correct? Should we be worried about Musk's Nazi salute or Kanye West's pro-Hitler song?
I mean, extraordinary to hear this from someone living in America. I went round with my wife, I think a year or 2 years before the insurrection at the Capitol. And I was, I've always wanted to write about the American Revolution, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and so on. All of which I saw them. There they were in Washington, and I was in awe of these documents, because, as I see it, what they are is the great triumph of the Enlightenment, this great glory of the Enlightenment. America as this extraordinary beacon of the Enlightenment that came to save us during the Second World War, that is a truly extraordinary country that one can look up to in all sorts of ways. And I felt that going around Washington, going around the Capitol, seeing the apotheosis of Washington on the dome of the Capitol, of the solidity of the building, and so on. And then a year or two later, it's being trashed, and they're trying to hang the Vice President of America. And you can honestly say, oh yeah, people are over egging this. I mean, it's your country. You live there. Maybe all this is wrong. Who knows? But
I don't want to turn this into a conversation about America. But of course,
but from my point of view, what it demonstrates is the immensity. This is what I write about in the book. If there's one lesson I've learned, and I say lesson, I don't believe history's got any lessons. If there's something I take from this history that's overarching, what that would be that everything is fragile, and often a great deal more fragile than we think. That's the recurring theme of many of the interviewees that I met who never saw this coming. I met so many people, for example, who, when Hitler was appointed in 1933, thought it's no big deal. We've had lots of changes in Chancellor, and that he's just a front man for all these elites. This one socialist politician, amazingly brilliant man, who was put in Dachau shortly after he had this view, which was, he said, well, we thought it'll fail and it'll be our turn soon. And that's the level of fragility that we're talking about, I think, with institutions and democratic institutions. And unless there is an incredible movement to understand that, and complacency is going to destroy all these democracies.
Is that then the lesson for you, the core lesson from history, that history is fragile and that we can always write these what appear to be charlatans or mountebanks off? Trump, of course, comes to mind. Is that the central warning from history, in your view, in the Nazi mind?
The kind of, I think that one of the central warnings, because as I say, I don't think history has any lessons. The only lesson from history is things change. There's no lesson. It's not a scientific experiment, I don't think. But in terms of warnings, the fragility of democracy is an absolute core one. And it doesn't mean that it's going to all fall tomorrow. You can have the most fragile piece of glass on your mantelpiece, and it can stay there for 50 years. But someone can just touch it and it breaks. That's what I mean by fragility. And in terms of the warnings that I take from this, they're all designed to say, what can we take from the Nazi experience that's a concern for us today? And certainly the freedom of the press, the independence of the judiciary, how judges are appointed, the right to free speech, and so on. All of these sorts of things you can see in various societies around the world are less safe today than they were 10 or 20 years ago. At least that's what my perception is. And I think the perception of people who've actually studied it.
You noted earlier, though, that what the Nazis did was unique in history, the industrial mass murder of millions of people. And I wonder whether what you talk about, the fragility of democracy, and of course you're right, but a push against democracy, you mentioned Europe, Orban in Hungary, perhaps Trump, certainly Trump, probably in the United States and elsewhere, throughout the world, Israel, India, Italy, perhaps even. It's not Nazism, is it, Laurence? I mean, one can be a soft authoritarian, one can not particularly like democracy and be unsympathetic to judges and sometimes the rule of law, particularly when the rule of law doesn't agree with you. But what does that have to do with Nazism?
I'm not for a second saying that that all these different things around the world are trying to create Nazi states. I make that very, very clear in the book. I mean, the point I make in the book is that people please stop saying someone else is a Nazi or whatever, because I really hate all that, or he's another Hitler. Absolute gibberish, because Hitler is not going to come again. The genetic circumstances of Hitler and the cultural circumstances that made him are over and gone. He's not going to happen again. The National Socialist German Workers' Party isn't suddenly going to appear with its policies again. Absolutely not. My point is that the core values of Nazism, or this violent nationalism, appalling racism, appalling anti-Semitism, a whole series of anti-democratic actions, particularly the destruction of a free press, the destruction of an independent judiciary, all these sorts of things. The development of an incredible and I interviewed a lot of neuroscientists and psychologists for this to try and bring it's a history book, but to bring that dimension to it. But what they call the them and us dichotomy, which is crucial to Nazism, which is absolutely vilifying of them over there, and within that, what's called pseudo-speciation, which is seeing the them not even as human beings. All of those sorts of things have echoes today. And you don't have to be a Nazi to subscribe to them. What you're doing is taking these elements of it, however unconsciously or consciously, and seeing them today.
Why do we have such an obsession, though, with Hitler? I mean, you only have to go on YouTube to see all sorts of spoofs on Hitler. I found one on Hitler's reaction to the bar exam results. On the one hand, there are people like you who are reminding us of the seriousness of Hitler and the lessons and the warnings of Nazism. On the other hand, he's become this literally absurd figure that everyone seems to be obsessed with. Of course, we have the famous Goodwin's law, where you can't disagree with anyone, as you noted earlier, on the internet without, after a few minutes, being accused of being a Nazi or Hitler. Do we need to be careful about trivializing Hitler?
Of course. I mean, ever since I did a 6-part TV series on Auschwitz. I wrote and produced that, and I wrote a big book on Auschwitz, and then I wrote another book on the history of the Holocaust. And ever since then, I'm pursued. I'm not on social media. I'm not on social media for a number of reasons, but one is I'm pursued by Holocaust deniers. I mean, it's kind of okay, there we are. And these kind of crazies are out there. In my view, bigger than that problem is I live here in Britain in a historically illiterate society, which is that the majority of children give up the study of all history at the age of 13 or 14. So you say, oh, people are obsessed with Hitler. And actually, I think the vast majority of people don't give a toss one way or the other about Hitler. That when we did the Auschwitz series, we did a poll to see what people knew of Auschwitz before the series went out. And it turned out that half the population did not know what the word meant. And I think the bigger...
And this is in the UK. I shudder to think what the response would be in the US.
The bigger issue is absolute historical illiteracy. So what can happen as a result of illiteracy and lack of knowledge is all this nonsense, all this misinformation, all this fake history, to coin a phrase, comes in to fill the gap. And part of that, I guess, is turning Hitler into a joke. It's not a funny story. Part of that is to say the Holocaust didn't happen. Part of that is to believe any kind of craziness, nonsense you see on the internet, and you believe it or go along with it because you never knew the basic history yourself anyway. Because in this country, at any rate, you gave up the study of history at 30.
Although I take your point, Laurence, and you're not the first or last person to articulate that kind of cultural pessimism. But your book has been a bestseller in the UK. It's had almost 200 excellent reviews on Amazon. It's a bestseller also as an audiobook. So there is still a great deal of interest in this.
Are you kidding? Sorry. I mean, yeah, I should be so lucky. The fact is, to be a best-selling history book, you sell, I don't know, 10, 20, 30,000 copies, 40,000 if you, my Auschwitz book, which was this huge bestseller like all around the world, I think sold 250,000 copies. A 250,000 copies, the population that's around the world, the population of Britain is 60 million. I think you're not going to change. Unfortunately, I got to face facts. You're not going to change the world with a history book. I wish you would. I wish you could. So when you say, oh, lots and lots of people are interested in all this, actually, when I was running history programs at the BBC, we discovered that the biggest audiences were not for Nazi. It's an element of myth. The biggest audiences weren't for Nazi or World War II programs. The biggest audiences were for iconic British history. I think even history books, a book on Elizabeth I.
Men dressed up in pink, yeah.
Yeah, Elizabeth I or Henry VIII is always going to outsell Nazis if you're looking at it in commercial terms.
Certainly in the US with obsession with Washington and Jefferson.
Yeah, I was at an American airport the other year or so ago, and I go in looking into the bookshop in the history department, and it's got history as one section, and then it's got Civil War as a section, and it's bigger than the history section. So the notion that people know about Hitler and even the Second World War, I wish it was so. I wish it was so that people thought, oh, stop going on about it. But everywhere around me, I see evidence just of ignorance, really.
I wonder, I've always wondered about this, Laurence. I may have asked you last time, I can't remember. I take your point, but still, if we want to think of a warning from history, it's Hitler. Before Hitler, was there a Hitler? In the 1910s or 20s, when people looked for warnings from history, where would they look? Was it Napoleon Bonaparte?
Yeah. I think primarily, but they would look at them. I mean, I was in this discussion once with somebody else because we made a kind of a drama-y film about Genghis Khan when I was doing it. It was an incredible production. They got the Mongol army to dress up. It's amazing. It was an amazing film, actually. But and I was looking at this and seeing Genghis Khan, and I don't know, estimates on how many people Genghis Khan killed are like insane. Tens of millions. And I was looking at this and I was thinking, why is it that Genghis Khan doesn't have the same resonance or power to it as Hitler? And I thought, well, first of all, it's immensity of distance. And actually, it's very, very hard to imagine the period that Genghis Khan was operating in, or indeed why he was doing it or where. So that's one factor. And so it's kind of with Hitler, what you're dealing with is the level of, still to us, modernity, the fact that Germany is a cultured nation at the heart of Europe, and the fact that it has very, very clear and obvious resonances to us today in a way Genghis Khan simply doesn't. But before Hitler, I think people pointed very much to Napoleon. Stalin, for instance, was incredibly interested in Napoleon and was always worried. That was one of the reasons he pushed forward and killed some of his best generals in the 30s, because he was always worried that the lesson, as he saw it as a lesson of history, was that you have a revolution and then the army figure arrives like Napoleon did in the French Revolution and kind of subverts it and takes over and becomes emperor. And so he was always conscious of that as a kind of concern. You look at Hitler. Hitler was a big hero. His big hero was Frederick the Great, and he had a portrait of Frederick the Great on the wall. But neither of those figures, Frederick the Great or Napoleon, none of them have the same, none of them, essentially, to put it crudely, orchestrated the Holocaust.
Yeah, finally, speaking of the Holocaust, we did a show recently with a novelist, Joseph Olshan, who has a new book out built around the life of Primo Levi, the Italian survivor of Auschwitz. His book, If This Is a Man, is one of the great masterpieces of the period. And one of the things that mystified Olshan and many of us is why Primo Levi, 20 years after Auschwitz, committed suicide. It seems to change your mind. The Polish survivor of Auschwitz, Borowski, Tadeusz Borowski, who authored another wonderful book, This Way for the Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen, also committed suicide. You obviously weren't in Auschwitz, so it's an entirely different experience. But how has this changed your life? I mean, you noted we began with the way in which accidentally you became a documentarian of this. How's your life changed, Laurence? What has it meant to your life overall?
Well, you know, I made a film about the effects of Auschwitz on people, and called Touched by Auschwitz years ago, and actually met many Auschwitz survivors, and I could certainly vouch for the fact that you don't get over it, or in the vast majority.
Put it mildly, yeah.
You know, it lives. There's you know, but then I think if you know you suffer horrendous abuse as a child, or any I mean, you know, that these kind of traumas. I mean, Auschwitz is a million times worse than I can almost imagine anything else to be. I think it's incredibly difficult. And so when people ask me this kind of question, I always say, you know, actually I've not suffered in making making anything. I give you an example. I mean, for me, you see, I was on the years ago, I was on the BAFTA jury for Best Documentary, and there was a documentary about AIDS children who were AIDS victims of in South Africa, and they were essentially, their parents had died, and they were these small children living on the streets, living on scraps, or you know, rat infested buildings and so on. And I cried all the way through it, and it was just awful. And what was interesting to me was, though I am affected by all this, particularly the deaths of children. There's a sequence in the Auschwitz series where we look at the transportation by the French, a scandal, an absolute scandal. The French volunteered up these children who were sent on their own to Auschwitz and gas. It was horrendous. And whenever I saw that sequence in the film, I was crying and crying and crying. And we had to watch the film any number of times when you're editing it, you know. But nonetheless, a contemporary event had an impact on me, and I wondered why what's going on here. And I reasoned that it was because that was still happening. It was happening as I watched it. It was happening out there in South Africa, and I was here in safety and not doing anything about it. Whereas the thing about history is I cannot do anything about it. It's happened. And so that element of it for me gives it a kind of, paradoxically, this sort of safe space. Of course, you're upset by what you read and everything, but it's different from knowing the suffering that you feel impotent, that you're not doing something about.
And I always say finally, and there's always one more question. I promise this is the last one, Laurence. You've been very generous with your time. Since we last spoke, Martin Amis's novel, The Zone of Interest, was turned into an Oscar-winning movie by Jonathan Glazer. The Zone of Interest, in my mind at least, this resurrected the Arendt debate about the banality of evil. There was certainly something rather banal about Rudolf Höss, at least in the movie, and his family and their involvement with the Holocaust. Did you see the film, and what did you think of it?
I didn't. Although I seem to remember in the novel he thanks me and my book on Auschwitz as a research source. So,
oh well, that's nice. But of course, Glazer was very controversial in his Oscar speech. He referred to Gaza and Israel, which upset a lot of people. Any thoughts on that? Final thoughts, Laurence?
Well, no, I haven't. But the answer is I haven't seen it because
in terms of this,
I don't watch drama.
in terms of warnings from history, the 12 warnings from history is one warning, perhaps for Netanyahu and the Israelis in Gaza, or is that another story entirely?
I would never ever do that. And the reason I wouldn't do it is because what I deliberately do in the book is I set out what I think we can usefully take from this history. But it's a history book. It's a narrative history of the development of Nazi mentalities, variety of Nazi mentalities, that then I say, okay, what can we take for this usefully to think about today? But I don't go into, and in these countries, you can see tick this box kind of thing. And I don't do it because it would be phenomenally presumptuous of me to do that. I've spent all this time trying to understand this history. I don't understand the details of what's going on in the political history of America or Israel, or I have views on it, but I've only got your view. I mean, I've only got the views of someone who reads newspapers and looks at stuff. That's a different level of expertise to what I hope I'm bringing to this. So that's one reason. And secondly, it's because what I've found, as the book sold now all over the world, is that in each territory it's gone to, I've had people say, wherever it is in the world, I've had people say, yeah, that's made me think about X or Y in my country. And that's because they know that country way more than me. And I think they get more from it if they make that link themselves.
Well, that's good stuff. You've made all of us think. Laurence Rees, author of The Nazi Mind, 12 Warnings from History. Wonderful conversation. And I hope it won't be another 4 years, Laurence, till we get you back on your show. What's the next project?
Right.
What are you working on now? Not another Nazi book. You probably had
enough. No. I'm really doing something new, which is I'm doing something broader about the Second World War. So I'm really spreading my wings,
Okay, well, we'll get you back on the show. Keep well, Laurence. Keep thinking. Keep offering warnings from history. We need them. Thank you so much.
Take care.